Right. So there's an additional problem that I just thought of.
Yes.
And thank you for explaining that.
Okay, sometimes I'm not playing, sorry.
Because it's sometimes you have to,
Yeah.
But it's correct me if I'm wrong. It's an act of essence that God, from this argument, would create some entity to share the love with and an entity to cooperate to share the love with.
Yes.
But it would be an act of will to create a fourth entity.
Yes.
Okay.
Or any more, yeah.
But someone can say, well, if it may not be an act of essence, it may be an act of will, but it could have happened.
Okay, but the problem that you have is another essential attribute of a divine person is metaphysical necessity. Now the problem is metaphysical necessity means that being cannot not have existed. Now the problem that you have is any being that's created by will is contingent. It didn't have to exist. So with that argument here, by creating that fourth divine person, that divine person would be contingent rather than necessary. And so then might not have existed, and thus will not have the essential attribute of metaphysical necessity, and so wouldn't be divine in the same way as the other three divine persons.
Okay, so
those three divine persons are each necessary, metaphysically necessary.
And you would say the fourth one would be contingent because it would come from an act of will.
Act of will. It didn't have to exist.
And also, at one point, it did not exist.
And one point did not exist.
Okay, so now coupling this problem with the initial, I just remembered what my other problem was, which is why that definition of love. The definition of love is, okay, so you have a wife, you share everything with your wife, and then you have a child, and then with you and your wife, you then cooperate and share that. You're taking those definitions and you're throwing them up towards the divine, right? Metaphysically. So how does? Oh yeah, but you had those people at your so what was the point? Yeah. So this definition, like, why should we go with it?
Yeah. So I take a specific view in religious language called the univocal view. So I take that terms that we use for God are univocal when they're used in a normal, mundane human context.
I don't understand. Say that
Sorry. I take a univocal view to our use of language. Univocal just basically means when we use a word, it's used in the same way as when we apply it to God. So if I understand what goodness is by a human context, that is also applicable to God in the same way.
Right, but there's a big problem with that. So I'll give you a problem from the Islamic theological framework, right? And that problem is, say, God says in the Quran, God says He will forget them like they forgot Him. Now, as a Muslim, when I read that verse of the Quran in which God says, I will forget them like they forgot God, right? I know that forgetfulness is not the same as for a human being and God, because God would be deficient. So forgetfulness in the human sense is you have a cognitive deficiency, you forgot to recollect a particular memory, retrieve it in some way or the other, and God, it doesn't apply to. So also this would apply to things like, okay, so when it comes to the Islamic theological framework, and also in Christianity, these attributes of God which I mentioned, like the hand of God, or these types of things. But we know, as Muslims and Christians, and again, I may be making statements about Christian theology which may not be correct, and also I believe this is the same for the Jewish people, is when it does say things like the hand of God, we know that doesn't mean a physical, tendons and this type of thing. That in Islam we have a whole discussion on this, but we wouldn't take forgetfulness or other types of things and then say, okay, it's exactly like a human being, right? So that, what did you call it?
Univocal. So
univocal.
Yeah.
Where did that come from?
Yeah. So there's three different distinctions between language use. You have univocal, equivocal, and analogical. So basically, univocal means you use the word in the same way in a different context.
And that's the view you hold.
That's the view I hold. Sure. Equivocal means you're using the word, but it doesn't mean the same thing. Okay, so I'll give you an example. When I use the word bat And you need to ask me what I'm talking about, because I could be talking about a cricket bat, I could be talking about a bat that's flying
Or
around.
the wing of a hospital.
Or the wing, yeah. So those words are using an equivocal sense.
Equivocal.
Yes. Univocal just means, like, let's say blue. If I say I have blue shoes and you have blue shoes, or the sky is blue, I'm using blue in the exact same way. And then analogical is where you're saying you're using it in a similar way. It's very similar to it, but it's not exactly the same. Analogical gets a little bit more difficult, so let's just go with the first two. Univocal, I'm trying to say to you that I don't believe you can use equivocal language when you're talking about God. You're saying, yeah, God is good, but God is not good in the same way that we mean goodness. God is powerful, but God is not powerful in the same way that we mean powerful. Because then the question is, what are you meaning then when you say God is powerful? We only understand it because we have an understanding of what power is in our context. We then apply that, but then what we do is that we qualify it when we apply it to God. We say God is powerful, but God is all powerful. God is knowing, but God is all knowing. God is good, but God is all good or perfectly good. And so we qualify it. So we say God is good in this way that we mean goodness. Mother Teresa's good, but she's not good exactly like God because God is perfectly good. But we are using the word in the same way in those different contexts.
But Josh, isn't there a problem? Not only as in Muslims would deny that use of language, but also I think some Christians would also say that that's not.
So it's this view was debated in Christian theology throughout the century. So you have Thomas Aquinas. He went against the univocal view.
I would expect.
Yeah, he went against it, but he then at one point he was holding to the equivocal, but then he believed that was problematic, so he took the analogical route. You have Moses, Maimonides.
Sorry, just about this. Yes. So that would mean St. Aquinas would not accept this argument.
No, he wouldn't accept. He never forwarded this argument. But I'm not a Thomist, so I don't hold to everything that Aquinas says.
You're not what?
I'm not a Thomist, so I don't hold to everything that Aquinas says. Yeah. He is very amazing, but in areas I would disagree with him. Because I would say that.
So if I just to clarify, that would basically mean a large section of Christianity. Christians would not accept this argument because of language.
I would say that actually contemporary sort of philosophy of religion, looking at religious language, they are taking more the univocal route.
So what would you say, just for my knowledge, because I'm ignorant on this, William Lane Craig, what does he hold?
Univocal.
Really?
Yeah, 100%.
So
univocal, him, Swinburne, Plantinga.
Alistair McGrath?
I'm not certain about McGrath because he's more of a theologian than a philosopher, so I don't look into it. But let's say the three main Christian thinkers will be Alvin Plantinga, Richard Swinburne, and then to a lesser extent William Lane Craig. They all share this view, and so there's this debate in Christian theology between something called classical theism and theistic personalism. So basically,
theistic personalism and classical theism.
Yeah, theistic personalism basically says that God is a person like us, but he is a supernatural person. He is all-powerful, all-knowing. So that's the view I'm arguing for.
Right.
Saying God is actually a person like us, but he's not limited like us in our power, limited in the knowledge, limited in goodness.
And that fits the univocal
view. But then you'll have the classical theists who argue more the Thomistic route, and say actually we don't believe this theistic personalism. The main idea is because of divine simplicity. I don't know if you ever heard that term.
Yeah, this.
So God is without parts. So God is not composed of any parts.
I think Keith Ward uses this.
Maybe he might use it. I'm not really certain. But it's basically Thomas was very, very strong. Thomas Aquinas on this idea that God is simple in a divine simplicity sense. Just basically means God lacks all parts, and so what God has, God is identical to. Now, so God is identical to his goodness, God is identical to his power, God is identical to his essence.
I'll give you a little Islamic theological sort of nugget here, right? The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said, reflect about creation, do not reflect about God, because you cannot basically grasp the essence of God except by believing in him. So when it comes to these types of things, it kind of reminds me of, the whole discussion around good.
Okay.
What is good, right? And two people one may be a consequentialist, one may be a Kantian, they may disagree on good, one may be a theist or an atheist, but they both know what they're talking about. There's like that common denominator. So when it comes to God, we wouldn't go as far as I think what Christian theologians have been doing, which is you take it to such a discussion where it's almost like everyone's climbing up the tree, people go into different branches, and then they're talking past each other. Because it depends on which language view you hold on to and which framework you hold on to. And again, I would go back to my initial point, which is God's message should be very simple, and the Islamic theological framework is extremely simple. And we would also argue that Moses, Abraham, and all the rest of God's prophets, they would be completely baffled by, say, these sort of discussions. They would believe what I believe, right? They wouldn't go down this sort of route.
Yeah, but I think
because God's not the author of confusion.
Okay,
That's one Bible verse I know.
Okay. But where I'll have to disagree with you is that I do agree with you that things should be simple, but when we are trying to understand things specifically which are ontologically different from us, they can be difficult to grasp and understand. So I would say with you, we have a shared problem with, for example, understanding what it means for God to be all-knowing. So being omniscient. You would hold to, as a Muslim, God is omniscient, he knows all things. I'll hold to it as well as a Christian. But then we will have problems because we're trying to understand, well, God is all-knowing, but what about the idea of human free will? Does human free will negate God being all-knowing? Can he know, does he have foreknowledge? Can he know the future?
You're very right, Josh. And Christians would get into those discussions, and some Muslims did in the past as well. However, from an Islamic perspective, we would simply say, God is all-knowing, and human beings have free choice. We can take actions. Logically, how do you make sense of it? We as Muslims would simply say, we just believe in it. Right?
That's difficult though, because I mean,
it's not really.
No, but think about it. I mean, I can understand that if you're in a non-pluralistic environment where everyone's Muslim or everyone shares the same worldview as you, it's very easy to just say, yeah, we have these things which are difficult to reconcile logically, but we just believe it. But if we're in the 21st century pluralistic environment where there are different options in play here, and people want to understand which one has truth value, which worldview actually has truth value. Well, if one worldview is saying that there is this God who is all-knowing and he has foreknowledge, he knows the future, but yet also you're required to believe that we have free will, and probably in the libertarian sense, that you can choose A or choose B without being necessitated to choose any one, then you have a problem because you're saying, well, how does God have this knowledge? Because if I'm going to choose a pizza tomorrow, instead of a burger to eat for, let's say, dinner or something like that, did God know that before? Well, yeah, he did know it before, but then does that mean then that I have a choice? Because
Look,
I can falsify his
I get your issue.
So I'm saying my problem is you can't escape the question if we want to argue for the truth value.
But we're not escaping the question. We're not escaping the question. We're just giving the actual answer. From the Islamic perspective, even having deep theological discussions about predestination is something which is discouraged, right? Now, in terms of, like you said, in the 21st century, in the 21st century, there's lots of options and people are having these sort of discussions, these questions are opened up. But remember, look, there's nothing new under the sun. If we look back at during the time of Jesus, right? I think it was a Roman soldier or a Greek soldier who came up to either Jesus or one of his disciples. And there was some sort of question about God, and one of the Greek or Roman soldiers, because they were affected by Hellenistic philosophy, they said something to the effect of, what is God? Or something like this. I don't remember this exact passage in the Bible. But as in, from the early days of Christianity and the early days of Islam, you've always had many different philosophies competing. It's not that in the 21st century we've had this and we haven't had this in the past. The second thing is, what I would do, and I do this often, maybe some people like this approach, some people don't. Not every question needs an answer. Sometimes people ask the wrong question. So for example, somebody may ask me, how do you reconcile Islam and free will? Or free will and predestination. Or someone may ask me as a Muslim, why is it that your Prophet married a 9-year-old? Or why is it as a Muslim you have this or this or this or this? I would redirect them to a more important question is, what do you think is going to happen after you die? Do you believe in God? What do you think about the fact that we're materialistic and we should be connected back to God? So I would take people back to more important questions rather than dealing with questions which, frankly, people don't realize, but they're irrelevant to their salvation.
Okay, but why I would say it's not irrelevant is because before you can, as I was saying before you can claim something has a truth value, that thing has to be coherent.
Yes.
That thing has to make sense if it's going to have some form of, we will even be able to understand if it has truth value or not. Now, the problem that you have is for some people, there is a logical contradiction with the idea that we have, as humans, free will, and that God has foreknowledge. So someone would just simply say to you, I'm not even going to even begin to look into Islam because the Islamic concept of God is incoherent.
Okay.
So the same way that you were saying before, married bachelors or squared circles or whatever, those things are logically incoherent. So I don't even look to see if they have any truth.
But we as Muslims wouldn't say, we would simply say it's a lack of our knowledge, right? So I'll give you an example. Firstly, when it comes to coherence, it's a very slippery term, right? And there's a whole discussion about what coherence means, what it doesn't mean. However, as a Christian, you must agree with me that for the most part, most of the questions which are being asked, even about Christianity, are questions which are irrelevant to the central core message of Christianity. And the same I would argue for Islam. That most of the questions that people ask about Islam, what do you think of ISIS or Al-Qaeda? Of course, we're going to get an answer like we don't believe in that nonsense. But at the same time, we have to bring people back to the core of the belief, right? And I believe, and I'm not sure if you've gotten into this before, but these discussions never end. Discussions about, look, philosophically, we just had a discussion earlier about Richard Swinburne's argument. You did a PhD in Trinity, right? So I'm guessing, what, was it 100,000 words? 80. You spent 4 years, 5 years?
No, three years. Three and a half.
Your 3 years worth of work, you can't say you finished the discussion.
Oh, but what
do you see? And I'm not saying I agree with this, because I don't agree. But say a Christian missionary goes to an African village, right? They go to Philippines, they go to whatever, Romania. They go to any place in the world, and this place, they're trying to preach Christianity. They're not going to open up a can of worms like here. They're just going to tell people, this is how you get salvation, right? As a Muslim, I try and do the same thing. This is how you get salvation. I don't want to open up for them deep theological problems which philosophers and theologians have not resolved for hundreds of years.
But I would say to you, where I agree with you in part, why I disagree with you is because you need to emphasize that conversations like these are relative to the context. So obviously, if I'm going to a tribe in Africa and I want to tell them about Jesus, I'm not going to start talking about omniscience and homoousios and omnipotence.
So Josh, why doesn't that apply to anybody else?
No, so I'm saying, if we're having, it depends on person. So if I'm speaking to, let's say, a fellow philosopher or a fellow intellectual in this specific area, we might have this debate because he might say, actually, when you actually reflect on the attributes of God, they cancel each other out. Or there is a problem here, blah, blah, blah. But if I'm speaking to, let's say, someone else, my daughter, I'm not going to go and say, hey, this issue or blah, 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 because they don't need to know until they come to the problem.
Okay, but Josh, here's an issue I have with that. I do see what you're trying to get to, but here's an issue I have with that. A lot of the people who raise these type of problems, right, the free will paradox or whatever it is, you usually get this from people who don't even believe in God in the first place, right? So what I do with people like that is I first talk to them about God without getting into this discussion first, because their reason for asking is not to get an answer. It's just a way of distracting the conversation away from God. Like, I truly believe that when people, especially a lot of atheists that I deal with, when they come up with questions like this, things about the free will, or things about the morality of the 7th century, or the morality of the century during the time of Moses, or whatever, I see these as red herrings, because the central issue is they don't want to submit to God, right? So that's why I don't bother with these discussions.
I would say it's not a red herring. Oh, it depends on the person, because obviously they might just be saying it.
Well, I most of the time speak to atheists.
No, but I would say to you that these debates, actually a lot of them are not happening by atheists, they're actually happening by people who are theists, who are saying actually the concept of
it's
God
an inter-Christian issue.
Yeah, so I'm saying, so I'll give you an example again with Richard Swinburne. Swinburne will actually argue that given this issue of free will, God doesn't have foreknowledge. So God is omniscient, but he lacks foreknowledge because of free will. So he would actually say that a coherent view of God will not hold to omniscience that includes foreknowledge. And so this is problematic because I promise you, the majority of people will say, I'm not going to worship a God who doesn't know the future. That's a problem, isn't it?
Of course it's a problem, and this is why saying that statement, at least from an Islamic perspective, would be tantamount to not believing in God in the first place.
But he would say, but at the end of the day, you need to be intellectually, not you, I'm saying in general, we need to be intellectually grounded in our understanding of God, because maybe many things that we believed about God don't make sense. I'll give you an example.
Just a point here. if something doesn't make sense to us as limited beings, it doesn't mean that that state of affairs is not true. As an example, say let's go back 100 years. You're an intelligent person. If I came up to you, not 100 years, 200 years, came up to you and I said to you, in the future, this idea that, the simple idea that the world is made up of atoms which are indivisible, that's going to be thrown away, and we're going to have a crazy world of quantum mechanics where things react differently to when they're being observed, to when they're not being observed, and all that crazy stuff. You will say that doesn't make any sense to me, right? But not making sense to you does not mean that quantum mechanics is not real. So when it comes to these issues, the way I see it is, we need to redirect people back to the core of salvation. And from an Islamic perspective, salvation is by the simple message of La ilaha illallah, which means there's none worthy of worship except God. And all of these questions